Good day, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Executive Insights by Shipping and Freight Resource. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Harish Manadia, the founder of Shipping and Freight Resource, a niche information resource for the shipping and freight industry, and talking about digitalization of the industry. And today we have a guest with us, Chris Southworth. He's the Secretary General of ICC United Kingdom, and also the co-chair of the Legal Reform Advisory Board for ICC's Digital Standards Initiative. Welcome to this session, Chris. Glad to have you here.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So let's talk about the burning issue, which is the electronic trade documentation, which has been spoken for many years, and it appears it's finally becoming a reality. And in your view, why did it take so long? I mean, this should have been on the cards for much ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, we just did the sort of timeline from 1992 to today on the whole trade digitalization agenda, and it's very, very clear that, you know, when we initially had things like the Rotterdam rules, we had the WTO e-commerce rulebook way back in 1992 or 1994. There was a long lag period of about 10, 15 years where not much else happened. And then we've seen more progress in the last 3 years than the 18 years previous. And that's very, very obvious in the momentum. I think that's, you know, for probably a couple of good reasons. First of all, technology, you know, the emergence of blockchain and new technologies that allow us to handle particularly commercial trade documents, that is now readily available in the market. And that's obviously changed the possibilities. So technology is not the problem here. It's actually the lack of legal reform is now the problem. And then I think, you know, wider drivers like COVID have obviously played a big part. You know, has really focused the minds of governments that we really do need to digitalize trade. It's a very, very inefficient and antiquated system. And, you know, governments see that as a real opportunity for economic growth, obviously in the wake of the pandemic, and global trade to some degree slowing down, certainly in some parts of the world, you know, really slowing down. You know, I think governments and lawmakers are spotting this as an area of opportunity. It's not an expensive activity from their perspective, but it will deliver a lot of economic reform. The business cases we published in 2021, I think, also played a big part. It put real numbers on the opportunity, and that really made a huge difference in terms of it changed the conversation actually with international institutions and governments. It wasn't, you know, just about making the case because it's a nice thing to do. This is actually worth an awful lot of money, both in efficiency savings and also growth and additional trade finance. So I think probably a combination of those things have all, you know, some of it a little bit of luck to some degree, if I can call COVID luck in the context of this, obviously, this environment, have converged into one moment in time where, you know, it's ripe for change. And then from a business perspective, you know, the benefits are obvious. You know, there's this sort of horrendous world of paper and bureaucracy, checking, rechecking, duplicating, spending weeks and months on these crazy documents that really should have been taken out of the system a long time ago. Suddenly there's a real possibility that this is going to happen. We're not talking about it anymore, we're actually doing it. And then in 2020, I should mention the creation of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative changed the game entirely because, and prior to that, the publication of the ICC Digital Trade Roadmap, that was actually the tool that suddenly put structure on the conversation. It was about setting out, what do we need to do? Why do we need to do it? And importantly, who does what? Because prior to that roadmap, it was really unclear. Governments weren't clear on what was being asked of them. And then we just broke it down into sort of 3 pillars of work. One was legal reform. Obviously, that's a government lead where we need some help. Then standardization, connecting systems and platforms. That's an ICC lead, ultimately with the international standards community. And then the third pillar, which is actually for all of us, is implementation. How do we implement a paperless system where information can flow in standardized formats, data formats? That led to a large degree to the creation of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. And what that's provided is the missing link, really. It's that market failure of coordination, or lack of coordination is a market failure, bringing together all the standards bodies into one industry advisory board, and then all the multilateral development banks and international institutions and business organizations into the legal reform advisory board, and then launching kind of 2 programs down each pillar. One, the big global call to action now to remove legal barriers so we can digitalize commercial trade documents, and the second to actually now start putting a proper framework around what standards do companies need to adopt, where and when in the system. The issue on the standards side is, the baseline problem is just fragmentation. It's just thousands of systems and processes and platforms that don't talk to each other, so information can't move from one system to another. The solution, of course, is standardizing the information, and then just like Apple and Microsoft did, information can flow between systems, and that's obviously a game changer. But just the proliferation of standards bodies, there are standards bodies in almost every country doing their own thing, and that makes life incredibly complicated for a company, because they don't know who to trust, they don't know which standards they're supposed to be adopting. You adopt the standard that you're being told is the right standard, and then when you cross the border, you quickly realize that's not the standard they've got in a different country. And that's all because we're not following international standards that are agreed across the standards community. That's exactly what the Digital Standards Initiative is doing. And then the publication of the WTO ICC Standards Toolkit at the beginning of last year was a real game changer. It suddenly set out which standard is the key one. What are the foundational standards? What do SMEs need to worry about? What do IT engineers need to worry about? It puts structure and order to the whole conversation, and that's incredibly liberating and allows us to move at a much faster pace with much more clarity. There's a lot more coming, I have to say, in terms of harmonized data templates and useful practical tools that businesses need if we're going to get off paper and finally into a modern digital environment where ultimately transactions can take place in minutes. We don't need to wait months. Money can transact at the same time as goods. Again, we don't need to separate those 2 activities. Those 2 worlds are converging very rapidly, actually, particularly with digital currencies and new types of digital financing. So it's very, very exciting and very, very innovative. And of course, that's captured people's imagination.
I can imagine all this took a long time. But for UK as a country, how important is this electronic trade document bill, and how do you see its impact on global trade, UK being the country that it is?
Well, we always saw that English law, so we say UK, but actually we've got to be specific. It's English law, actually, because English law is, it's because of the legacy and the history, going back in time, the role the UK's played in the trading system. It just so happens that, a lot of trade happens on English law. And so we knew that if we were going to prioritize legal systems, the UK or English law had to be right up there on the priority list. So we started getting into the whole English law issue quite a long time ago, 4 or 5 years ago, starting with investigating what's the problem, and then eventually partnering up with the Law Commission for England and Wales and the UK government, who, to their credit, really spotted the opportunity quite quickly, along with us. And that's culminated in the Electronic Trade Documents Bill. Now, from a UK perspective, it's important because, the UK strategy is to go paperless, to have, world-class paperless borders, frictionless borders. And so the Electronic Trade Documents Bill helps solve that problem, because the issue is not in customs, it's in the commercial side of trade. And that's where this law is the existing law is problematic, because it stipulates that you have to have commercial documents like bills of lading, bills of exchange, have to be on paper. And that's the case for most of the world. And then the UK, to their credit, did 2 things. First of all, it secured a G7 ministerial commitment. So we knew that we needed to get the big economies on board here, otherwise this is not going to happen. The G7 represent about 40% of global trade, so it's big, and the UK secured that ministerial commitment in 2021, and that really changed the conversation. Suddenly we had the big economies all now actively removing laws and mapping out roadmaps on how to do that. And then on a practical level in trade, 80% of bills of lading all operate on English law. So that's where this kind of, you get this broad amplification effect from English law. And what we're hoping is going to happen in May, June, when this comes into force, that's going to breathe some oxygen and put some rocket boosters under the digitalization of trade worldwide. And then, of course, we're focused on other parts of the world, like Hispanic law for Latin America and French law for the Francophonie and China. And, there's lots of projects on. There's in the region of 100. I think we're over 100 countries now, all making commitments now to remove legal barriers.
That's big. So that's big.
It's huge. And of course, that's our main message to business, really, is that we're not talking about this anymore. This is actually happening, and it's happening at scale, and it's happening at pace. And that's good news for everybody who's been around this slightly painful part of the trading system for a long time.
And talking about G7 and the like, obviously, given the prevalence of English law, do you see it's just passing it in Parliament in UK is enough, or are there some plans to make it mandatory in certain countries at least, so including England?
Well, it's a very smart piece of law. So the global framework is the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, or sometimes that's called MELITA, MLETR. That's the global framework for the handling of commercial documents in digital form. That's been in place since 2017. So the framework is there. That's a first-class piece of legal work. The challenge that we all have is at national level, we have to identify the legal barriers, and then we need to align our legal systems to the MELITA framework, and that allows commercial documents to move across borders and become interoperable. That's absolutely crucial. Where the Electronic Trade Documents Bill was really, I think, very clever, was not actually fundamentally changing the base law. So there are two pieces of law for those who are legal experts. There's the Bills of Exchange Act 1882. That's why it's out of date, of course, because it was written for a different time with no digital world. And then the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act in 1992. And those two pieces of law are fantastic pieces of law. Those have not changed. The Electronic Trade Documents Bill is actually a very small piece of legislation, but with a very, very important amendment. And that amendment says that documents in digital form are now will be on the same legal footing as paper. So it's not saying get rid of paper, it's enabling the market to now operate in digital. And that was very purposeful in the drafting of the legislation. And it doesn't really say a great deal more than that, other than, obviously systems need to be in secure technology. We need to use secure technology systems, but the key change is that just literally recognizing information in digital form in the same way that we do in paper. And of course, that puts it gives companies confidence they can operate in a legal environment with certainty. And that will unleash, of course, innovation into the market, both in the trade innovation, but also wider, because some of the instruments we're talking about here, particularly things like promissory notes, can be used much more broadly than just trade. At the end of the day, they're simply sort of IOUs. So sort of digital IOUs, you can see there are lots of applications for that, or potential applications, like Korea and China, who have thriving electronic promissory note markets. We used to in the UK, but we don't at the moment, nor do a lot of other countries. So this is about wider innovation as well as obviously trade, where we're mainly focused.
I'm glad you cleared that up, because there's a lot of doubts, a lot of naysayers saying, oh, this digital thing is not going to work and we still need paper, we will still use paper. But that is fine. Now, was it a strategic decision to wait till after Brexit to sort of implement this bill or pass it through Parliament? And how does it impact your previous EU neighbours?
Yeah, I don't think, well, just to the naysayers, I mean, all I say to them is I hear some people saying like that, we're not pretending that we're going to go, digital in a day. That's obviously not going to happen. We're going to be in a mixed hybrid world for some time. The ICC has set a very ambitious target to cover 60 to 80% of the world world trading environment in the enabling legislation, the Melita, and we're 40-50% currently working on it. So we've only got another 10% and we're already meeting that objective. So it's not that it won't happen, it is happening for one. And of course, we'll see the big corridors going digital first. It will take time, but that's definitely what's going to happen in the short to medium term. In the longer term, obviously, we will eventually get off paper, but we'll need to operate somewhere in between. But anybody who's advocating to stay on paper, I mean, that's just not an argument in my view. It's insanely inefficient, makes absolutely no sense economically whatsoever. But we do recognize that companies have been trading in a certain way for decades and centuries. And so this is a mindset change. It's a cultural change. And we've got to start somewhere. And it starts really by getting the legal environment right, getting the big, high value, high volume corridors moving in the right direction, and eventually working our way through the different sectors and down to the small companies who we know feel the pain of paperwork the most. They feel it more than the big companies. So I think that's what I would say to that argument. So I've forgotten the second part of the question now. I was so busy talking about that.
It's about the Brexit. Was there
Brexit,
a time frame in terms of Brexit?
There's no real connection to Brexit. I mean, I think what Brexit did do is put rocket boosters under the digitalization agenda for the UK, because it created an extra impetus. We have more of an impetus in this area than most, because we're so reliant on trade as an economy. And obviously coming out of Europe has imposed an awful lot of bureaucracy and additional paperwork. So anything that's going to bring that burden down is going to be welcome with ministers and businesses particularly. But we could have been doing this in the EU. We could have been doing this at any other time. So I don't think it's we're out of the EU, therefore we're focusing on digitalization. It doesn't follow like that. I think it's just a happenstance to some degree. And actually, to be honest, quite helpful in many ways, because it allows us to move at a fast pace, which is where we need to, and also enable the UK to help our neighbours. You talk about Europe. Europe's situation is a lot more complicated because there's no central mechanism to mandate legal reform at national level. That's a national competence. But the EU have been excellent. I have to say, they've been part of the G7 working group. They're acutely aware that there is a risk here of the EU fragmenting, with the G7 moving at a different pace to everybody else, and quite rightly concerned that they want a pan-EU solution. But at the moment, there's no obvious mechanism to enable that pan-EU approach. Okay, but Europe's pretty good at this stuff. I'm pretty confident the EU will have a solution in place, if not this year, then early next. But I don't think that will. There'll just be a lag while everyone's trying to figure out what the right solution is. Of course, you're talking 27 countries there, so once it starts happening, it will probably happen at knowing the EU probably pretty quickly. I should say that the EU is part of the group committed through the WTO e-commerce agreement. That agreement should conclude at MC13 in 2024, and that would be the legal commitment to the whole of the EU. So it's not happening. It will happen when that agreement concludes, and then it will all be about implementation.
Good. And in terms of banks and the revised or the new electronic trade documentation protocols, how do you see the roles of banks changing or advancing, or them adapting themselves to this new environment?
Well, the banks are interesting because the banks in almost every single country have really been at the vanguard of arguing for legal change. And we're seeing that as a sort of global trend. It's quite interesting. And I think that's partly because they feel the pain more than most. There's just an incredible amount of bureaucracy sitting on the banks because of varying sort of regulatory requirements. And that means that they're literally dealing with millions of documents flowing through those banks at any given time. And of course, that's slowing the whole system down. It's preventing the banks getting finance out to the companies they want to fund, because so much resourcing is going into, checking, cross-checking all the time. And a lot of it boils down to just, the need to use smarter technology solutions, it's not complicated at a base level.
So you're getting a lot of support from the banks.
Yeah, there's a terrific amount of support from the banks. And usefully for us is they are an extremely helpful conduit into the corporate community. So, of course, their corporate clients also feel the pain, and the banks really are acting as almost partners here. Well, they are partners in the call to action, and very much at the forefront of making the case for digitalization and supporting corporates and the wider trade community to also digitalize operations as well.
Good. And on that point, while we all speak about electronic bills of lading and the push seems to be on electronic bills of lading, what about the other trade documentation? I mean, there are other trade documents, of course, there's tens of them. Now, what sort of platforms are you planning on using, or has that been set up already, and how is that working?
Yeah, it's a good question, that. I mean, there are 8 documents that we're talking about here. So there are about sort of 35, 40 documents in total in trade. We're hoping that all of those will go digital. The ones that are really holding up the system are these 8 that relate to the ownership of goods. And that's where the law needs to change. I think we all sort of default to the bills of lading because they're such an important document. So they act as a sort of a bellwether, a sort of indicator, but they're by no means the only area where we're seeing progress. The Digital Standards Container Shipping Association's announcement last week was a game changer. So that's all the shippers now saying they're all going electronic bills of lading by 2030, and then 50% by 2025. That's a fantastic commitment, and we're going to see more of that kind of thing. So that's great because we're getting whole sectors and industries going. But electronic promissory notes are also being piloted at the moment. Lloyds Bank in the UK here has been very active in that space, but they're not alone. There's also bills of exchange, electronic bills of exchange pilots running both here and overseas in places like Thailand, and e-invoicing and e-packing lists and other warehouse receipts and other types of commercial documents. So, our commitment is, look, we've got to start somewhere. Let's focus on the kind of key documents first, but let's support all documents going digital. And let's start now running pilots to test the systems, make sure that they're operational, that the information is flowing from one platform to another platform, one system to another, and crucially with government, because those pilots that have run up to now have primarily been in the private sector. Well, in a transaction, you're going to hit 2 brick walls at both ends of that transaction, and that's going to be customs at one end and customs at the other end. So it's very, very important that government are on board here and also able to handle this information in digital form.
Absolutely.
So, it will take time, but as we slowly work through the system, testing all platforms, all different technologies, we're not being specific on technology solutions. That will help us make the case to the business community to say, look, we've tried the corridor, we've tested it, we've run the pilot, this is what it's valued, this is what you can save. Then also we'll see more scale coming. But at the moment, it's all about pilots, interoperability testing, new systems, and making the case for business. That's our top priority this year and next.
That's good. And in terms of the next few countries, which countries do you think is going to come up after UK in terms of adopting this MLETR? And because some of the big countries, like big trading countries at least, like China, India, USA, are not anywhere close to some of the other countries. But in your view, which country do you think is going to adopt this MLETR soon?
Well, the next big one will be Germany. We're expecting them to have the legislation in place this year or early next.
Okay.
China's now engaged with the Asia Development Bank, working through identifying where the legal barriers are in Chinese law. So that's already underway. The Japanese are doing the same with the Germans. Interestingly, there's a legal connection there, sort of post-war, where the Japanese use German trade law, which is kind of interesting. So those two have partnered up through the G7 process. The US already has now a federal solution. So in the US, excuse me, the problem wasn't that you couldn't trade these documents in digital form. The problem was that you could only use Delaware law to do it. And of course, that's not very helpful if you're in a different part of the States or you don't want to use Delaware law for whatever reason. And there was a lot of discussion at the beginning about, what's the federal mechanism? Is that legal, or could we do that through a different way? And towards the end of last year, they effectively ended up concluding that by amending the UCC, Universal Commercial Code, Article 12 is the technical kind of area of it, to expand that code to include commercial trade documents, that would allow every state to now handle these documents. The challenge now is to get each of the states, to adopt the UCC Article 12 amendment.
That's a lot more complicated than Europe, I would assume.
Well, it's not dissimilar to some degree, because you've got to go down, state-based rather than sort of national-based. But this is going to be the challenge that a lot of federal countries. So I've been particularly interested in the States, because we need some examples of how a federal country would manage this process, and it's going to be quite complicated.
Is it different from how Germany is managing, because they're also Okay.
Well, Germany's an interesting one, because there are three examples. This is a question I get quite a lot, is, well, why can't we just digitalize electronic bills of lading or electronic promissory notes? Well, there are three good examples why that makes no difference. And one of them is Germany. The Germans hate me for saying this, but it's true. Germany, Korea, Japan, where there is partial legislation in place. In Korea's case, it's promissory notes, for instance. In Germany's case, they've had legislation for electronic transport documents. And in none of those cases has it led to any wider transformation of trade. And that's because we think the default behavior in trade is, if all the documents don't go digital, everybody reverts to paper. In other words, it has to be a comprehensive whole approach to all the documents in the Melita framework, which is why I think the UK has been a great lead by example case study. Is we just need to now do all of the documents, and that's exactly what Germany is doing now, is both providing better guidance to companies on how to use electronic transport documents, but also filling that legal gap on things like marine insurance and other areas that weren't covered. I think e-promissory notes is in that other box as well, so make sure that there's a comprehensive solution. And then the more these economies obviously work together, then obviously that starts to build more momentum around these initiatives. So we'll see more of that over the next 2 years, where certainly the UK will be piloting into Europe as the next. At the moment, we're doing interoperability pilots with Singapore, but the next big set of pilots will certainly be with Europe, and that's very intentional, because that's one, a high value, high volume corridor, but also we know that will generate momentum into the trading system overall.
The other parts, yeah. Good. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much for your time on Executive Insights by Shipping and Freight Resource. I wish you, the ICC United Kingdom, and the ICC Digital Standards Initiative all the best in this unique journey. And I, for one, am really looking forward to seeing the effects of this trade digitalization. And this is something that I write a lot about. I also speak a lot about. So it's also something important, and I feel the need for this in global trade at the moment. So thank you again for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much for the opportunity.